Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 106, Minnie Hornblower. Minnie Hornblower featured in the newspapers in the late 1880s and mid-1890s in Melbourne for two reasons: child desertion and a bigamy case. Here is her story. Minnie Hornblower was born Constance Amelia Hornblower on the 11th of May 1870 in Collingwood, Victoria. She was the daughter of Henry Dyer Hornblower and Sarah Ann Mears. Henry Hornblower was an Englishman who emigrated and arrived in Sydney in March 1854. He was a cabinet maker and married Sarah Mears at West Maitland, New South Wales in December 1854 when he was 33. Sarah was also English and emigrated to Australia with her parents. Sarah's father, Frederick Mears, was the publican of the Robin Hood Hotel at West Maitland. On the 3rd of December 1867, in the Maitland Mercury and Hunter River General Advertiser, there was an advertisement for Henry Hornblower's business. Good business premises to be sold in consequence of owner's intended departure from Maitland, situated in High Street, West Maitland, known as Mr. Hornblower's cabinet-making establishment, also allotments in the rear with a frontage to Little Hunter Street of 60 feet, with all improvements thereon, will be sold together or separately to suit purchasers. The business was sold by early January 1868, in which the family moved to Melbourne. Minnie had 9 siblings: Henry Jr., who died at the age of 25 in March 1881 in Fitzroy; Cordelia Victoria, who married George Howard in Deniliquin, New South Wales, whom she had 7 children with. After George died in 1900, when her youngest child was only 1, she married Richard Griffiths in 1906, and she lived with Richard in Armidale in New South Wales. The 3rd child was George Horace, who died in Maitland aged 5. The 4th child, Septimus Alexander, died from scarlet fever at the age of 16 in 1875 in Victoria. The 5th child, Frank Johnson Hornblower, died on the 10th of March 1884, aged only 21. The 6th child, Claude Albert, married Mary Ellen McAvitt in Narrandera, New South Wales. He was also a cabinet maker, and they lived in Fitzroy South and Carlton, and he died in 1939 at the age of 74. They had no children. The 7th child was Alfred Ernest Fitzroy Hornblower. He was the first child to be born in Victoria to the family on the 3rd of April 1868. He married Mary Ellen Brown in Collingwood in April 1893. He was also a cabinet maker, and they had 2 children. Alfred died in November 1953 at the age of 85. The 8th child, Rufus Francis, known as Fred, was born in Collingwood in July 1874 and married Emily Jane Elizabeth Kingsford in Collingwood in April 1894. They had 3 children. He was also a cabinet maker and died in Sydney on the 24th of August 1951. And the 9th child, Ethel May, was born in Fitzroy in May 1879. She married John Kelson when she was 20 in 1899. John died in 1910, and then she went on to marry William Ranger, a dealer, in 1912. They moved to Chiltern in 1930. William died in 1935 and Ethel in 1939. They had no children. Sarah Mears, or Sarah Hornblower, died on the 20th of November 1880 at the age of only 47. Minnie Hornblower gave birth to a daughter, also called Ethel May Hornblower, in Carlton on the 11th of May 1889. And in the Melbourne Herald on the 2nd of September 1889, there was an article that was titled "Abandoning a Child." At the Carlton Police Court, a young woman named Minnie Hornblower was charged with abandoning her female child, 3 months old. John Murdoch, a lawyer's clerk, stated that about 8 p.m. on the 11th of August he heard cries of an infant, and on going outside his residence at 624 Canning Street, North Carlton, he found the infant on the doormat of his house. Constable Gorman stated that he saw the prisoner near Mr. Murdoch's house with the child a few minutes prior to the time the child was found. The next morning, the finding of the child was reported to the North Fitzroy Police, and he obtained a warrant for the prisoner's arrest. Margaret Harper, residing at 270 Fitzroy Street, Fitzroy, stated that a couple of months back, the prisoner and a man who represented himself as her husband came to live with her. On the morning of the 11th, she saw the child and heard the prisoner go out for the evening. The next morning, the witness asked the prisoner if a child was there, and she replied that she was gone. The next day, Constable Gorman came to her house and she identified the shawl and the baby as the prisoner's. Plainclothes Constable O'Sullivan gave evidence as to the arrest of the prisoner in a dance room in Gertrude Street, Fitzroy. He asked her if she did not have a child a couple of months previously, and she replied yes. On being asked what became of it, the prisoner replied that she had given it to Mrs. Smith, who resided in Young Street, Fitzroy, to adopt. She did not know what part of the street Mrs. Smith lived. The prisoner said she had advertised for someone to adopt a child, and Mrs. Smith had come to her in Fitzroy and afterwards made an appointment to meet her, and she gave her the child. She has not since seen Mrs. Smith, nor made any inquiries as to her whereabouts, as she thought the child would be all right. Mrs. Smith had fallen in love with the child as soon as she saw it and had taken it because she'd lost one of her own. The prisoner also admitted that the child was hers. The prisoner reserved her defence and was committed for trial. On the 30th of August 1889, abandoning her child. A young woman named Minnie Hornblower was charged with abandoning her illegitimate child. This case was another illustration of an old story. The unfortunate girl, after keeping herself respectable for some years, was in an evil hour inveigled into one of the low dancing rooms in Fitzroy, and as a necessary consequence strayed from the path of virtue, the outcome of which led her to commit the act she's now charged with. On the application of Sergeant O'Hare, she was remanded to Carlton. Now, not only did Minnie have Ethel May in May 1889, there is also records of a John William Hornblower born in Carlton in 1890, who lived only one day. Also Claude Sumner Hornblower, that was born in 1893 in Collingwood, and another child also named John William that was born in 1894 in Carlton. All of these births do not name their father. However, Minnie married John William Sumner in Victoria in 1891, and death records and other records attached to those children have him as the father of the children. So John William Sumner was born in South Melbourne in 1860. He was the fourth child of 13 to Hugh John Sumner and Catherine Dunn. His father, Hugh Sumner, was born in 1833 in Taunton, Somerset, England. So he was convicted at the Preston Quarter Sessions at Lancaster on the 7th of January 1846 for a term of 7 years for highway robbery. He stole a coat and money, and he had previous charges of housebreaking in which he received 1 month's jail sentence. He also got a 6-month jail sentence for an orchard robbery and 14 days in jail for vagrancy. At the time that he was sentenced, his mother was dead and he remained illiterate, and his crimes were typically juvenile felonies. He was sent to Australia and he sailed from Spithead on the 25th of July 1848. He came out on the Ratcliffe to Van Diemen's Land and arrived on the 12th of November 1848. His convict record states that he was 19 when he was convicted. However, when he married, he stated he was 21. His death certificate also reflects him being born in 1833. Hugh Sumner was stationed at Oatlands and received his ticket of leave on the 5th of May 1851. He received his certificate of freedom on the 9th of May 1853 and then married Catherine Dunn, who'd also been born in England, and they married at the Cathedral Church in Hobart on the 1st of November 1854. By 1858, they had moved to Victoria. In 1873, there was sickness in the family, and a son, Richard, aged 1, also died, and as a result, Hugh Sumner placed in an insolvency. It says Hugh Sumner of Collingwood, labourer, causes of insolvency, sickness and death in the family and pressures of creditors. Liabilities £20, 14 shillings and 8 pence. Assets £3 and 16 shillings, with a deficit of £16, 18 shillings and 8 pence. By the 26th of October of 1878, so 3 years after this insolvency had been placed in Collingwood, it was reported that Alice Sumner, no lawful visible means of support. The mother of the girl appeared and offered to take her daughter home. The daughter was sent to jail for a month to reflect upon her conduct. On going from the court, the girls said, "I will never go home again." So Ellen, Mary, Anne, Ada and Alice, so 5 children out of the 13 that were born in the Sumner family, were said to have run wild in the streets. They were larrikins. They earned criminal records for offences against public order and decency, and it mentions that Alice was the youngest and the wildest. However, all 4 Sumner girls did eventually settle down, and they were recorded in their parents' death notices in the age as married women. Hugh Sumner was a gas stoker, and he died at the age of 84 in Collingwood in 1917. When he died, only 4 of their children were still alive. So John Sumner, Minnie Hornblower's spouse, he had been married prior to Lilius or Lily Martin on the 2nd of July 1881 in Collingwood when he was 21 and Lily only 17. He had 3 children with Lily: Annie Elizabeth in 1883 in Collingwood, John William in 1885, who lived only a year, and Claude, who was born in 1891 and died at 2. Things weren't going so well for John and Lily. On the 24th of October 1888, in the Police Gazette, it mentions John William Sumner is charged on warrant with using threatening language to Lily Sumner in Westwood Place, Little Collins Street, Melbourne. Description: Victorian, labourer, 28 years of age, 5'4", short and stout, dark complexion, black hair and moustache, shaves, beard and whiskers. Offender has threatened to murder the complainant, who is his wife. Now, stories say that Lily, in inverted commas, kept house for a Mr. Levy, and Lily and Annie, her only surviving child, actually used Levy's name quite often around 1886 to 1891. Interestingly, the children that John Sumner had with Minnie mirrored the names of the 2 boys that passed away that he had with Lily. And looking at those dates too, John Sumner had 1 child with Minnie in 1890 and a child born with Lily in 1891. And yes, John Sumner was listed as the child that Lily had in 1891, but interesting that she was actually living in Mr. Levy's house with her daughter for that time. So I'm presuming that John Sumner may not have been the father, but Mr. Levy could have been. In 1895, on the 3rd of September, again in the Police Gazette, John William Sumner is charged on warrant issued at the instance of his wife, Lily Sumner, 493 Fitzroy Street, Fitzroy, with bigamy at Fitzroy on the 20th of March 1891. Description: 35, 5 foot 8 inches high, stout build, bow-legged, dark complexion, dark hair, dark moustache, very irregular teeth, wore a dark coat, faded green, light trousers and a black hard hat. On the 12th of September 1895 in the Mercury and Weekly Courier, Victorian newspaper, at the Fitzroy Court yesterday, John William Sumner was charged with going through a marriage ceremony with Minnie Hornblower on the 20th of March 1891, then being married to Lily Sumner. Mrs. Sumner, who resides at 493 Fitzroy Street, Fitzroy, informed the bench that she was married to the accused on the 2nd of July 1881 at Fitzroy. She lived with Sumner for 5 years in Oxford Street, Collingwood, and had 2 children, a boy and a girl. Take note that she only says that she had a boy and a girl, again alluding to the birth of the 1891 child as not being John Sumner's at all. In November 1886, the boy died, and in the following month the accused sold off the furniture and left her. She went to Palmer Street, Richmond, where she kept house for a man, taking her child with her. Up till 1891, she frequently saw her husband, who used to get money and clothes from the man whose house she kept. She went to Sydney for a year and met her husband on her return. About a year ago, she discovered he was married again and set to work to get legal proof. She secured the marriage certificate of the second union about a month ago, and on the 20th of August last obtained a warrant for his apprehension. In cross-examination, she admitted that she and her child had gone by the name of Levy when housekeeping for a man of that name. Mr. Kinsman's evidence showed that she was 17 years of age when married, and she had to obtain her father's consent before he could perform the ceremony. Minnie Hornblower of 143 Nicholson Street, Carlton, stated she was married to the accused on the 20th of March 1891 at the residence of Reverend Mr. Turner, George Street, Fitzroy. They lived together ever since. Lily, Mrs. Sumner, used to visit them and have tea, About 3 months ago, while on a visit, Mrs. Sumner contrived to get hold of the second marriage certificate and took it away with her. Detective Carter gave evidence as to the arrest. On the way to the watch house, the accused said, "I am not going to deny marrying again, but I thought she was dead. Macaulay told me after he came from Sydney." The accused was committed for trial. In the Fitzroy City Press the next day, the title of the article is "Too Much Married." At the Fitzroy Court on Wednesday, a labourer named John William Sumner was charged with bigamy. Sub-Inspector Young prosecuted and Mr S. Lyons defended. Lillian Sumner deposed that on the 2nd of July 1881 she was married to the accused by Mr Kinsman at his residence in Moore Street, the witness to the marriage being a Mrs Hunt and Mrs Kinsman. She and her husband resided at a house in Oxford Street, Collingwood for 5 years. During that period, 2 children were born. In December 1886, she and the accused quarrelled and agreed to live apart. Shortly afterwards, she obtained a situation as a housekeeper for Mr Jack Levy at Richmond. In the early part of 1891, Mr Levy decided to live in Sydney and she went with him. Whilst residing in Sydney, she visited Melbourne 3 times and on each occasion saw the accused. She left Sydney finally in 1893 and returned to Melbourne, and from that time has frequently seen the accused. Whilst living in Sydney, I was known there as Mrs Levy. At the request of the accused, I told a lodging housekeeper in Carlton that I was a widow, and I did not know until 3 months that the accused was married to Minnie Hornblower. Prior to that, I thought the accused was cohabiting with Minnie. Nathaniel Kinsman, pastor of the Victorian Free Church, produced a copy of the certificate of Lillian Martin and John William Sumner on the 2nd of July 1881. I cannot recognise either the accused or Mrs Sumner. Lillian Martin at the time of the marriage was 17 years of age. There was consent from George Martin, her father. I did not see George Martin. Minnie Hornblower deposed that on March the 20th, 1891, she went through a form of marriage with the accused, the ceremony being performed by the late Reverend J. Turner at his residence in George Street. Mrs Sumner visited me and the accused at our house several times. About 3 months ago, whilst having tea with us, Mrs Sumner stole my marriage certificate out of my box. Felicia Turner, widow of the late Reverend John Turner, minister of the Particular Baptists, produced a copy of the marriage certificate of John W. Sumner to Minnie Hornblower on the 20th of March 1891. She could recognise Minnie Hornblower, but was doubtful as to the identity of the accused. Detective Carter deposed that on the morning of the 4th, Sumner called at the detective's office and asked if there was a warrant out for his arrest. Witness who had known Sumner and his first wife for some years said, "Lily had obtained a warrant for your arrest on charge of bigamy." Sumner said, "I thought she was dead. A man who came from Sydney told me she was dead." Mr Latham, the chairman, said the bench was satisfied that the case was one for a jury to decide and would therefore commit the accused for trial and allow bail in 2 sureties of £50 each and the accused £50. And John Sumner received 6 months jail with hard labour, and that sentence was handed down on the 20th of September 1895. It did say that John William Sumner was found guilty of bigamy, but there was a recommendation to mercy. Mr Justice A. Beckett said that in view of the recommendation of the jury and having regard to all of the circumstances of the case, he would only pass a sentence of 6 months imprisonment. He was released early on the 26th of February 1896, and John Sumner died on the 12th of June 1909 in Collingwood, aged 49. Minnie married William Lilly in Victoria in 1900. William Lilly was born in Ararat in Victoria in 1871. In 1900, the year that Minnie married him, there is a Government Gazette notice. William Lilly, a warrant of commitment has been issued by the Fitzroy bench against William Lilly for failing to find a surety of £25 to keep the peace for 12 months. His description was a Victorian, about 30 years of age, 5 foot 3 or 4 inches high, slight build, dark complexion, dark moustache only, blue eyes, generally wears dark clothes. Lily Martin went on to marry Samuel Catach, a butcher in Fremantle, Western Australia in 1903. Her daughter with John Sumner, Annie, had married in Western Australia in 1901. The Daily News in Perth on the 3rd of July 1919 gives an insight into Lily and her personality. The heading of the article says, "A lively altercation, flying shoes and bottles, a Duke Street rumpus." A case involving neighbours occupied the attention of Mr Southey and Breeden, JPs, at No. 3 Court this morning, wherein Michael Maloney was charged with assault and defamation, and Mrs Mary Gallagher with having and insulting words, the complainant being Mrs Lily Catach. After some evidence had been given, the charge of defamation was withdrawn, and the two remaining charges were heard jointly. The two women concerned occupied a semi-detached house in Duke Street, West Perth. According to the evidence tendered by Mrs Catach, on the afternoon of the 5th of June last, she sent her grandchild out for some medicine. Only a small fence in front of the house separated the apartments, and as the boy walked down the path to the gate, while still standing at the front door, she heard Mrs Gallagher from her portion of the front veranda address him in terms of insult to Mrs Catach. Later, the witness said that she was out the back finishing her washing when she heard Maloney arrive on the scene. Mrs Gallagher urged him to enter the witness's house. Maloney, on seeing her, said, "You be, old cow, what are you doing to my landlady now?" The witness said, "You are only a boarder there and it has nothing to do with you." He was holding something in his hand which proved to be a worn-out shoe. After further insulting language from him, the witness threw a dish of water in his face. Simultaneously, he threw the old shoe at her, hitting her behind the left ear. She staggered back against the wall, thereby missing a bottle intended for her head. Maloney next kicked in her front door and used disgusting language. The police then arrived. George Alcock, 9 years old, corroborated the evidence of Mrs Catach. Constable Gee deposed that on going to Duke Street on the 5th, in approaching the place, he noticed Maloney climb back over the front of the dividing fence from the premises occupied by Mrs Gallagher, at which place he was a boarder. On investigation, he saw broken bottles, bricks and a wash basin lying on Mrs Catach's back veranda. They appeared to have recently been thrown there. At this time, she heard a man's voice making use of bad language, whereupon he leaned over the fence and admonished Maloney, who was under the influence of drink. Mrs Catach complained of an injured head, but on examination he could find no signs of an abrasion. Neither Maloney nor Mrs Gallagher made any allegations to him against Mrs Catach, and as far as he could make out, the bone of contention seems to be as regards to the children of the two families. Mrs Gallagher denied using any filthy language complained of, and in her turn accused the complainant of having used insulting language towards her. The witness further stated that Mrs Catach had tried to cause friction between her husband and herself by telling him that she neglected her children, never giving them their breakfast till midday. Michael Maloney gave evidence supporting Mrs Gallagher. The bench, after a short discussion, dismissed the charge against Mrs Gallagher, instructing that each side pay its own costs, but in connection with the charge of assault, they fined Maloney £1 with costs, amounting to £3 and 8 shillings, in default 7 days imprisonment. Meanwhile, Minnie and William Lily are living together in Collingwood in 1915. However, it seems that they are living separately in 1925 and 1927. On the 13th of July 1928, there's an article referring to Minnie titled "Revolver as Birthday Present." Charged with having on the 11th of July been in actual possession of a revolver which was not registered, Minnie Lily, aged 58 years, of Glasgow Street, Collingwood, appeared at the Collingwood Court on Thursday. Plainclothes Constable Holt said Lily came to the watch house at 9 o'clock in the morning and said that she wished to issue a summons with the object of having her husband bound over to keep the peace. She added that she had threatened to shoot him. I asked how she was going to do that, and she tapped her leg and said she had a revolver in her pocket. She produced a revolver wrapped in a handkerchief with ammunition and stated that she'd owned it for 20 years. I said to her, "You would not shoot a man with it, would you?" She replied, "I would rather hit him over the head with a bottle." Lily said, "I have had the revolver for 20 years. My son bought it for me as a birthday present. I was ignorant about the need for registering it." Mr Conlon, the PM, said, "You'll be fined 10 shillings and we will keep the revolver." 3.5 years later, on the 23rd of January 1932, a heading titled "Woman's Weapons." Attaché case, tin opener, fork used in an assault. How a woman assaulted a policeman with a varied assortment of weapons was described at South Melbourne yesterday, when Minnie Lily of Napier Street, Fitzroy, was charged with having using obscene language and having assaulted Constable Elliott. Lily was fined £2 on each charge. Constable Elliott said that Lily hit him with her attaché case, the contents of which spilt out on the footpath. She picked them up and tried to hit him with a tin opener, a fork and a pair of scissors in turn. So Minnie Lily is still recorded as living in Collingwood in 1937, but seems has long separated from William. As in 1934, William is listed as living in Collingwood, but not at the same address as Minnie. Minnie died in Collingwood in 1939, aged 69 years. Minnie's children, the first that was the basis of the article of Minnie abandoning her child, well, Ethel May became a state ward on the 21st of October 1889, and she remained in state care until the 11th of May 1909. Ethel married Henry Addison under the name Ethel Heldrum in 1914 in Victoria. So the assumption is that she was either adopted or she may have had long-standing foster parents and converted her name to Heldrum. Ethel was 24 and Henry 39 when they married. Henry was a carpenter. They lived in Paran and they had 5 children. Henry died in 1941 when their youngest child was 5. Ethel was living near Gisborne in 1972 and she died in December 1974 in Balwyn, Victoria. John William, the second surviving child of Minnie's, was born in June 1894 in Carlton. John enlisted in World War I at Eastern Hill, Victoria on the 7th of August 1914. He listed Minnie as his next of kin under Minnie Sumner. However, this was changed to Minnie Lily, stating that his father was deceased. John was killed in action at Gallipoli on the 8th of May 1915, aged only 21. So there you have it, the story of Minnie Hornblower and her husbands and her children. She featured quite a bit in the Melbourne newspapers at the time.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.